He never imagined that the land his grandfather worked so hard to preserve would become the battleground for one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. He wasn't breaking the law, he wasn't hurting anyone. Yet the homeowners association showed up at his door with threats, paperwork, and fines that seemed impossible to fight. They didn't see a rightful owner, they saw someone they believed they could push aside, someone they thought wouldn't stand a chance against their power. And when they slapped him with a staggering $250,000 fine, it wasn't just money they were trying to take, it was his dignity, his history, and his place in the community. But here's what they didn't know. The man they underestimated carried a truth so powerful, it would turn their entire world upside down. A single reveal that would leave the entire neighborhood and the HOA stunned into silence. So, what happens when a man society tries to silence refuses to stay quiet? Stay with me, because this story will change the way you look at power, race, and justice. And before we dive in, make sure to hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because these are the stories that deserve to be heard. Marcus Johnson had always been a man of quiet strength. To anyone passing by his property, he looked like just another homeowner. Someone who kept his lawn trimmed, his fences painted, and his family close. But to Marcus, this land was much more than soil and grass, it was legacy. His grandfather had purchased those acres decades ago, during a time when black families owning land in that part of town was almost unheard of. Every tree, every stone, every corner of that ground held a story of struggle and triumph. For Marcus, mornings began the same way. A cup of strong coffee, the sound of birds rising with the sun, and the view of fields stretching beyond the horizon. He was proud, not just of the house he built with his own two hands, but of what it represented: security, sacrifice, the kind of peace his ancestors had fought so hard to secure. The neighborhood, however, wasn't as peaceful. Over the years, Marcus had watched it change. What once was a quiet rural community had grown into something new. Manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and an association board that seemed more interested in control than in community. The HOA Home Owners Association had gained a reputation. Rules upon rules, restrictions upon restrictions. At first, Marcus ignored it. His land had been there long before the HOA was even formed. He wasn't part of their meetings, their votes, or their endless disputes about mailbox colors and fence heights. But it didn't take long before the letters started arriving. At first they were small, violations tucked neatly into his mailbox. A warning about a shed that was too close to the road, a notice about the unapproved crops he grew, even though his family had farmed there for generations. Marcus tried to brush them off. This was his land, his rules. Surely they couldn't touch him. Still, something in the air told him otherwise. He began to notice how some neighbors looked at him, long stares, whispers that trailed off when he walked past. Cars that slowed as they drove by his property, windows rolled down just enough to see inside. The tension wasn't loud, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. And then came the day that shifted everything. Marcus opened his mailbox to find not just another warning, but a thick envelope filled with legal jargon and bold numbers. $250,000 in fines. Violations stacked one after another, as though they had combed through every corner of his land searching for reasons to punish him. His heart pounded as he read the papers. They weren't just trying to control him, they were trying to break him. What the HOA didn't know was that Marcus was holding on to something they had overlooked, something hidden in plain sight that would soon flip the balance of power completely. The stage was set, and the fight for his land and his dignity was only just beginning. Marcus could barely breathe as he stood in his kitchen with the stack of papers in his hands. The HOA's notice wasn't just a letter, it was an avalanche designed to bury him. Page after page listed fines. Grass an inch too tall, paint not up to community standards, crops deemed unapproved. The total, $250,000. It was absurd. This wasn't some suburban tract house on a half-acre plot. This was his family's land, sprawling fields, barns, fences older than the HOA itself. But absurd or not, the message was clear. They were coming for him. At first, Marcus tried to fight back the logical way. He attended a meeting. It was the first time he'd ever stepped foot into the HOA's pristine clubhouse, where polished floors gleamed under fluorescent lights and rows of neatly dressed board members sat behind a long table. Their eyes tracked him the moment he walked in, measuring him, dismissing him. When his turn came, Marcus stood tall, voice steady. He explained his land wasn't subject to HOA rules, that it predated their existence. He reminded them this wasn't just property, it was heritage. But before he even finished, he could see the smirks, the folded arms, the whispers exchanged between members. One man leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mr. Johnson, rules are rules, and if you want to live in this community, you'll follow them like everyone else." The room chuckled softly. Everyone else. Marcus knew what that meant. He had lived long enough to recognize the code beneath the words. He wasn't like them. He didn't belong. The meeting ended with no resolution. By the time Marcus left, his truck tires crunched over gravel under the watchful gaze of neighbors peeking through curtains. He wasn't just fighting fines anymore. He was fighting the weight of something much larger, prejudice, hidden behind legal language and bureaucracy. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew. Letters arrived more frequently. Threats escalated. Failure to comply will result in legal seizure of your property. He could barely sleep, every creak of the old farmhouse sounding like another intrusion. Every knock at the door sending his pulse racing. Then came the real blow. A sheriff's deputy arrived one afternoon, papers in hand. They weren't just threatening anymore. They had filed suit. The HOA was taking Marcus to court. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. Whispers followed him at the grocery store. Parents pulled their children closer when he walked down the aisle. It was as though the entire community had already decided he was guilty. Marcus pored over the documents late into the night, his kitchen table buried under stacks of legal threats. He felt anger, fear, exhaustion, but most of all, determination. Because deep inside, he knew something the HOA didn't, something they had overlooked in their arrogance. The land they were trying to claim, the soil they said fell under their rules, wasn't just his, it was theirs. Legally, technically, historically, Marcus owned more than his house and his fields. The truth was buried deep in decades-old deeds, paperwork handed down through his family line. Deeds that outlined not just his property, but something much bigger. Something that would change everything once it came to light. But would he reveal it now? Or wait until the moment it would have the most impact? Marcus folded the papers and tucked them into a weathered leather folder his grandfather once used. He whispered to himself in the silence of the night, a promise echoing in the empty kitchen. They think they can destroy me. But soon they'll see who really holds the power. The fight was no longer just about fines. It was about dignity, about standing against a system designed to push him down. And the storm was only beginning. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Neighbors, reporters, even board members who once ignored Marcus now filled the seats, whispering, speculating, and waiting to watch him fall. The HOA had painted him as a rule breaker, a man unwilling to respect order. Their lawyers arrived in pressed suits, armed with binders and smug smiles. They thought it was already won. Marcus walked in quietly, shoulders squared, clutching the same weathered leather folder that carried his grandfather's legacy. Every step echoed like a drumbeat, each one a reminder that he wasn't just walking for himself. He was walking for every ancestor who had worked this land, for every voice silenced by systems stacked against them. The trial began. The HOA's attorney rose first, voice booming with confidence. They presented photographs of Marcus's land, violations circled in red. They spoke of community values and equal enforcement of rules. But beneath every polished phrase was the same message Marcus had heard his whole life. You don't belong here. When it was his turn, Marcus stood at the podium, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then he began, not with anger, but with clarity. "This land," he said, holding up a deed so old the paper had yellowed, "was bought by my grandfather in 1954, long before this neighborhood existed, long before this HOA formed. These so-called rules you're using to find me don't apply, not because I don't respect order, but because you never had authority here to begin with." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. The HOA lawyer shuffled his papers, suddenly less confident. But Marcus wasn't done. He opened the folder wider, revealing document after document, deeds, plats, surveys. His family's name etched into every page, signed and sealed. And then came the bombshell. This neighborhood, the streets you drive on, the homes you live in, was all built on land that my family sold. Legally, historically, I don't just own my house. I own the very foundation of this community. And while you tried to bury me under fines, you forgot to check who truly holds the ground beneath your feet. The room erupted. Some gasped in disbelief, others whispered frantically, phones came out snapping pictures. The HOA members sat frozen, pale, their authority crumbling in an instant. Everything they had used to intimidate him, the letters, the fines, the lawsuit, had backfired spectacularly. For Marcus, the moment was more than vindication. It was survival, it was justice. It was proof that no matter how stacked the system seemed, the truth still had power. His voice trembled, but not from fear, from the magnitude of what this moment meant. The judge called for order, gavel pounding against wood, but nothing could silence the truth now. The HOA's empire of control had collapsed with a single revelation. And yet, as Marcus gathered his papers and returned to his seat, one thought lingered in the air, an unspoken question heavy with tension. If this one man could bring them to their knees with nothing but history and truth, what else had been hidden? And how many others had suffered because they never had the chance to speak? When the gavel struck for the final time, the case was dismissed, the $250,000 fine gone, the HOA's accusations shattered. Marcus walked out of that courthouse not just as a man who had defended himself, but as someone who had changed the narrative. For years they had tried to silence him, box him in, strip him of dignity. But on that day the truth stood taller than their lies. Neighbors who once looked at him with suspicion now looked with awe. Reporters followed, capturing every detail, every statement. Some congratulated him, others offered apologies they should have given long ago. Yet Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Because he knew this victory, as sweet as it was only one battle in a much bigger fight. Yes, he had exposed the hypocrisy of the HOA. Yes, he had reclaimed his voice and his land. But the scars of the struggle, the months of stress, the weight of being singled out, the constant reminder that his skin color had been the spark for this fire, those would never fully fade. He had survived, but survival came at a cost. And that's the heart of this story. Marcus's victory isn't just about land or money. It's about what happens when systems designed to exclude are finally forced into the light. His case became a reminder that racial injustice doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind fine print, legal jargon, and community rules. It creeps into board meetings, neighborhood associations, and everyday interactions where power is wielded quietly but painfully. But here's the deeper truth. For every Marcus who wins, there are countless others who never get the chance. For every story that ends in justice, too many end in silence. And that silence is what allows injustice to breathe, to grow, to repeat. Marcus's story forces us to ask ourselves, how many voices are still being ignored? How many families are still fighting battles that no camera ever captures? And how many times will we let history repeat itself before we decide enough is enough? This wasn't just a fight over property. It was a fight over belonging, over dignity, over the right to exist without being questioned, fined, or pushed aside for simply being who you are. And in that sense, Marcus's story is not just his own, it belongs to all of us. Because the question remains, if one man with nothing but truth and courage could dismantle an entire system of control, imagine what we could do if we all stood together. So now it's your turn. Don't just watch this story, carry it, share it, talk about it, because silence protects the system. And stories like this, they crack it wide open.